An Indian oil tanker carrying 2 million barrels of Iraqi crude was given clearance to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. Then, Iran fired on it anyway. The radio transmission captured the captain's disbelief in real time. That single incident on April 18, 2026, tells you everything you need to know about where this conflict actually stands. Hello and welcome. I am Rick Orban. And you have started watching The Truth Global. On the morning of April 18, 2026, the world's most critical oil corridor went dark. Again. Iranian Revolutionary Guard gunboats opened fire on a commercial tanker in the Strait of Hormuz. The vessel, Sanmar Herald, an Indian-flagged, very large crude carrier hauling nearly 2 million barrels of Iraqi crude, had been given explicit clearance to pass. Then the guns fired anyway. The radio transmission captured it in real time. Seppa Navy, you gave me clearance to go. You are firing now. Let me turn back. That sentence, simultaneously terrifying and absurd, is the perfect encapsulation of where we are today. A strait that carries a fifth of the world's oil supply has become a geopolitical minefield, and every actor involved, the United States, Iran, India, and global energy markets, is making calculations that could unravel what's left of the ceasefire. This is not just a shipping dispute. This is the collision of nuclear diplomacy, imperial posture, economic warfare, and raw military brinkmanship. Stay with us, because what happens in the next 72 hours could reshape the Middle East for a generation. If you're watching this for the first time, subscribe and turn on notifications. This situation is moving by the hour. To understand April 18th, you have to go back to February 28th, 2026, the day the United States and Israel launched coordinated surprise airstrikes on Iran, targeting military installations, nuclear infrastructure, and government leadership. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was assassinated in those opening hours. The strikes also destroyed Iran's nuclear enrichment facilities at Natanz, Isfahan, and Fordow, sites that had spent decades becoming the nervous system of Iran's atomic ambitions. Iran's response was immediate and sweeping. It declared the Strait of Hormuz closed, launched retaliatory missile and drone attacks against Israel, U.S. military bases, and Gulf Arab allies, and dispatched the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy to enforce its blockade with lethal authority. By March 2nd, the IRGC had officially confirmed closure of the strait and warned that any vessel attempting passage would face consequences. By March 5th, they had refined that warning. Closure would apply only to vessels linked to the U.S., Israel, and their Western partners. This was not chaos. This was calculated escalation, leveraging the world's most sensitive energy choke point as a weapon of economic pressure. The war had begun, and with it, a crisis that would draw in every major power on Earth. With the war entering its fourth week, back-channel pressure began to mount. NATO declined to intervene. China declined to intervene. Trump's appeals for help were met with silence. What emerged instead was a fragile diplomatic opening, brokered not in Washington or Brussels, but in Islamabad. For 21 hours, U.S. and Iranian negotiators sat across from each other in Pakistan's capital, attempting to sketch the outlines of a deal. The talks collapsed. Iran had offered a 5-year moratorium on uranium enrichment. Washington, which had formally demanded a permanent and total ban, rejected it outright. Trump himself had dismissed even the U.S. side's internal proposal for a 20-year moratorium, calling it a win for Iran. Yet on April 8th, a 2-week ceasefire was announced, and almost immediately, both sides began contradicting each other about what had actually been agreed. Trump claimed Iran had agreed to everything, including surrendering its enriched uranium stockpile and transferring it to American custody. He posted on Truth Social that the U.S. would retrieve all the nuclear dust. Iran's foreign ministry didn't just disagree, it erupted. Spokesman Esmail Baghai declared that enriched uranium was, quote, as sacred to us as Iranian soil, and that it will not be transferred anywhere under any circumstances. The ceasefire clock was ticking, and the two sides weren't even agreeing on what the ceasefire meant. This is where things connect in ways most coverage has missed. While Iran was enforcing its closure of the strait against Western vessels, the United States was simultaneously launching its own blockade of Iran. On April 13, 2026, at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, the U.S. Navy formally activated a naval blockade of the Iranian coastline. U.S. Central Command announced it would encompass, quote, the entirety of the Iranian coastline, intercepting, diverting, and potentially capturing any vessel entering or departing Iranian ports without authorization. In the first 24 hours, more than 10,000 U.S. military personnel, backed by over a dozen warships and dozens of aircraft, were on station. 6 commercial ships were redirected back to Iranian ports. Iran, in response, warned that any U.S. military vessel approaching the strait would be viewed as a breach of the ceasefire. There were now in effect 2 simultaneous blockades, one imposed by Iran on Western shipping, one imposed by the United States on Iran's entire coastline, operating in the same body of water, enforced by opposing naval forces with rules of engagement that were not publicly disclosed. The fuse had been lit. The only question was how long it would burn. Amid the diplomatic fog, something strange happened. Iran appeared to reopen the strait. For a brief window, markets reacted explosively. Oil prices dropped 13% in a single session, and the Dow Jones Industrial Average surged over 1,000 points as investors priced in the return of Persian Gulf oil flows. The energy market's relief was visceral and immediate, but it was premature. On April 18th, Iranian military officials issued a new statement declaring that the Strait of Hormuz had reverted to its previous state and was back under strict management and control of the armed forces. The brief window of commercial passage had closed. The IRGC was back on patrol with live weapons. This was not happening in isolation. Iran was simultaneously offering what appeared to be a geopolitical carve-out. It reportedly offered Europe free oil transit as an inducement to stay out of the conflict, while refusing to resume formal talks with Washington. The strategy was clear: splinter Western unity, maintain leverage over global energy markets, and keep the U.S. isolated diplomatically, even as American warships patrolled Iran's coastline. The strait had become not just a physical choke point, but a psychological one, opened and closed like a valve to send signals, not oil. Elsewhere, a nation that had spent months trying to remain above the fray was now directly in the crossfire. India had built one of the most delicate balancing acts in modern foreign policy, maintaining deep energy ties with Iran, strategic partnerships with both Washington and Moscow, and quiet diplomatic channels to Tehran. That balancing act collapsed on April 18th when Iranian gunboats opened fire on Sanmar Herald and forced Jag Arnav, a second Indian-flagged vessel, to reverse course out of the strait. Both ships had been cleared for transit. The incident prompted New Delhi to summon Iranian ambassador Mohammad Fatali for a formal protest, a rare and pointed diplomatic signal from a country that had worked meticulously to avoid exactly this kind of confrontation. Between March 14th and 24th, India had successfully evacuated 5 Indian-flagged LPG carriers from the strait in coordinated operations under the Indian Navy's Operation Sankalp. Iran had, at the time, permitted passage for Indian, Chinese, Russian, Iraqi, and Pakistani vessels, a selective exemption list that signaled Tehran's desire to preserve relationships with non-Western powers. But the April 18th attacks suggested that even those exemptions were no longer reliable. India's energy supply lines, diplomatic relationships, and strategic positioning in the Indo-Pacific were now all simultaneously under pressure. At the center of everything, the blockade, the ceasefire, the talks, the attacks, is a single unresolved question that has defined U.S.-Iran relations for 20 years. Iran's nuclear program. The war's stated justification was, in part, to destroy Iran's pathway to a nuclear weapon. American and Israeli strikes hit Natanz, Isfahan, and Fordow, the physical infrastructure of Iran's enrichment capability. But physical destruction of buildings does not destroy knowledge, and it does not destroy stockpiles already removed from those sites. Trump's claim that the U.S. would jointly dig up enriched uranium from the rubble of bomb facilities and transfer it to American custody reflected either a misunderstanding of nuclear physics or an attempt to project a political victory that had not been secured. Iran's response made the stakes plain. Foreign Ministry spokesman Baghai declared that halting enrichment or surrendering uranium were absolute red lines. Iran's position had not moved. Meanwhile, its hardcore domestic constituency, already furious that the war had extracted enormous sacrifice, was demanding answers. After all this blood and all these sanctions, one Iranian commentator asked, if you were going to give up the uranium and the Strait, why did any of this happen? The nuclear question, in other words, is not just a geopolitical problem. It is an existential, domestic political question for whoever survives in power in Tehran. What we are witnessing in the Strait of Hormuz is not simply a maritime dispute or even a war. It is the visible collapse of a diplomatic architecture that was already failing before the first bomb fell. The ceasefire reached on April 8th was always fragile, built on unverified claims, mutual misrepresentation, and the competing domestic pressures of two governments that cannot afford to be seen blinking. Trump's insistence that Iran had agreed to everything, Iran's categorical denials, the gunfire on Indian tankers, the dueling blockades, these are not negotiating tactics. These are the symptoms of a crisis with no clear exit. The world's energy markets have now learned that the Strait of Hormuz can be opened and closed like a tap, that ships granted clearance can still be fired upon, and that no commitment made in this conflict should be treated as final. For India, the crisis exposes the limits of strategic non-alignment. For Europe, Tehran's offer of free oil transit is a seduction that comes with strings. For the global economy, every hour the Strait remains under contested control is an hour of compounding uncertainty. The ceasefire clock is running out. The second round of talks has no scheduled date. The IRGC is back on patrol. And the uranium that both sides claim to have resolved, remains unaccounted for. Watch this space. The next move will determine whether this conflict is entering its final chapter or just its most dangerous one. If this breakdown helped you understand what's actually happening in the Gulf, share it with someone who needs to know. And subscribe for coverage as this continues to unfold.